Hello, everybody. I'm Carrie Clark, a senior staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, and I'll be your moderator today for our webinar, License to Sell Tobacco Retail Licensing, Nuts, Bolts, and Fees. Today, we're going to highlight the main provisions of a California-specific model tobacco retail licensing ordinance and discuss the significance of each of these provisions. And then we're also going to demonstrate a new TRL fee calculator that we've designed to help you determine licensing fees and costs. This webinar is offered by the Law and Policy Partnership to End the Commercial Tobacco Epidemic, which is a joint initiative of the American Lung Association and the Public Health Law Centers to support tobacco control professionals in their work to end the commercial tobacco epidemic in California. I'm here from the Public Health Law Center, which is hosting this webinar. We're a national nonprofit network of legal centers and attorneys that support commercial tobacco control and public health at the local, state, and national levels. We're located at William Mitchell School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people, also known as the Sioux Nation. This region is shared territory with the Anishinaabe, also known as the Ojibwe or Chippewa, and the Ho-Chunk Nation also has a historic relationship to the region. Our organization supports public health and commercial tobacco control by providing free legal technical assistance in a variety of ways. We also don't represent clients in court, and we don't lobby. Finally, our organization is committed to the principle that good public health cannot be achieved without addressing health equity. We have three presenters on our webinar today: Julie Amajuoyi, Kira Hill, and Stephanie Lackey. Julie and Kira are staff attorneys at the center. They provide legal technical assistance to public health professionals and advocates working on commercial tobacco control policies throughout the United States. And they're also part of our California state tobacco team. Julie serves on our Minnesota state tobacco team and also has a strong public interest background, as well as a graduate degree in theological ethics. Kira is an environmental attorney and serves on our center's FDA project, where she closely monitors the federal regulation of tobacco and e-cigarettes. Finally, Stephanie Lackey is the center's digital communications specialist who provides technology and communication support for the center. Stephanie holds a Master of Science degree in Environmental Studies and a Certificate of Public Health from the University of Montana, Missoula, where she focused her graduate studies on environmental justice. Stephanie helped design our online TRL fee calculator. So Julie is going to start us off by looking at a model California-specific TRL ordinance, and then Kira and Stephanie are going to walk through the TRL calculator. So with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Julie.
Thanks, Carrie. Let me share my screen. Thanks, Carrie, for that introduction. So I'm Julie Amajuoyi. I'm going to be walking through a comprehensive tobacco retailer licensing ordinance, which is published on our website and is available for download. Just to give a background on tobacco retailer licensing, a licensing policy, as you all probably know, is a foundational policy for reducing youth access to commercial tobacco. A licensing policy requires businesses to obtain permission before they can sell certain products within the jurisdiction, and it imposes conditions on their operation. Currently, at least 39 states require a license for over-the-counter tobacco sales. So I'm going to walk through our comprehensive tobacco retail licensing ordinance and highlight various key provisions contained in that ordinance. So the ordinance, this ordinance begins with an introduction, which explains the ordinance. It also includes tips for customizing the ordinance to the jurisdiction's particular needs. And then it begins with, scroll down here. So the first section here is a findings section. A findings section is important because it explains the evidentiary basis for the policies included in the ordinance. In addition to serving an educational purpose, the findings can also serve a legal purpose. If the ordinance is ever challenged in court, the finding statements are typically an admissible record that shows the factual determinations made by the legislative body when considering the ordinance. So section 2, next section here is a definition section. And definitions are key because they clarify the understanding of the ordinance, both for compliance and enforcement purposes. So, they provide clarity to the retailers who are subject to the regulations in the policy, and they also provide clarity to those charged with enforcing the policy. So some of the key definitions, of course, you want to include definitions, relating to the products that are regulated. For instance, you want to include a comprehensive tobacco product definition. You also want to include a comprehensive definition for electronic smoking devices. You also want to include definitions for those, pertaining to those who are being regulated. You want to include a definition for tobacco retailer, and you also want to include other key definitions that relate to the policies included in the ordinance. For instance, if the ordinance includes a flavored tobacco sales prohibition, you want to make sure you have a good comprehensive definition of a flavored tobacco product. So this policy, this ordinance includes several policies for jurisdictions to consider, and the definitions they choose to retain would depend on the policies they actually choose to adopt. So the next section, section 2, is general requirements and prohibitions. So this is where we include this section includes the requirement for a tobacco retailer license, making it unlawful for any person to engage in tobacco retailing within the jurisdiction without first obtaining and maintaining a valid tobacco retailer license. It also includes a provision, a minimum legal sales age provision prohibiting sales to persons under 21. That includes a requirement to check IDs. We know that one of the benefits of a tobacco retailer licensing program is that it can help reduce sales to youth. Across 33 California communities, sales to underage persons dropped by almost 30% after implementation of a strong retailer licensing law. It can also help reduce youth tobacco use initiation. In California localities that had a strong tobacco retailer license, youth were 33% less likely to have initiated tobacco use compared to localities that had no licensing law or that did not have a licensing fee high enough to cover the costs of enforcement. So another provision included here under section 3 is the prohibition on the sale of flavored tobacco products. So, and this is a very comprehensive prohibition. It would prohibit the sale of all flavored products, including menthol flavored products, and it would apply to all retailers. Jurisdictions may also choose to include provisions regulating tobacco product pricing and packaging. So here you have provisions that prohibit the sale of the distribution of free or nominally priced tobacco products. You have a prohibition on tobacco coupons and discounts. You also have provisions that establish minimum package size as well as minimum prices for little cigars and cigars. So the next section imposes limits on who can obtain a tobacco retailer license. One benefit of a retailer licensing program is that jurisdictions can regulate the type of businesses that are licensed to that can sell tobacco products. They can also regulate the number and density of tobacco retailers. We know that communities with a higher concentration of tobacco retailers expose more youth and young adults to commercial tobacco industry marketing, making it easier for them to obtain these products. High retailer density is also linked to higher tobacco use and health disparities. So these are some key provisions that jurisdictions could choose to include in a retailer licensing program. So some of the limits here is a limit on mobile vending. No license will be issued to authorize tobacco retailing to a movable place of business. So only fixed location tobacco retailers are eligible to be licensed. It also includes jurisdictions could choose to include a provision prohibiting issuing licenses to a pharmacy. They could also, again, as I noted, impose proximity or density restrictions, establishing a minimum distance between tobacco retailers and youth-oriented facilities such as schools or playgrounds. So, and we have the bracket here indicates the jurisdiction can determine what the minimum distance they would like to have. Some jurisdictions have like 1,000 feet, and some can have it even higher, say 1,500 feet. Jurisdictions can also establish minimum distances between tobacco retailers, and they can also establish minimum distances for jurisdictions where they have cannabis retailers. They can establish minimum distances between a tobacco retailer and cannabis retailers. Finally, they can also set a cap on the number of licenses within the tobacco retailer licenses within the jurisdiction. So the next provision on population and density would limit the number of tobacco retailer licenses based on the population of the city. So for instance, they can say, the total number of retailers shall be limited to one for each, say 2,500 inhabitants of the city or county. So the next section, section 6, includes the application procedure, what the prospective retailer should include in an application for a retailer license. And in the next section on license issuance or denial, it includes some basis for the jurisdiction, the basis that may lead to a denial of an application for a license. And then section 8 addresses license renewal and expiration. The next section, section 9, simply says that licenses are not transferable. So you can transfer a license between one person to another or from one location to another. Section 10 simply notes that licenses are privileges, not rights. So a license conveys a limited conditional privilege. Section 11 addresses fee for license. My colleague Kira, who's going to speak next, will walk through our TRL fee calculator and how communities can calculate the cost for a license. But generally speaking, the fee should be calculated to recover the total cost of administering, implementing, and enforcing the ordinance. So this includes the cost of issuing the license, administering the license program, retailer education, retailer inspection and compliance checks, and other enforcement costs. Under California law, the fee should not exceed the cost of the program, however. So it should include all of these, but should not exceed those costs. The next section, which is very important, is compliance monitoring. The strength of any tobacco retailer licensing program depends also on how well it is enforced. So this section would specify how frequently the jurisdiction is going to inspect tobacco retailers. So, a jurisdiction could have more than one inspection, at least one that to check compliance with the minimum legal sales age provision, and perhaps more to ensure compliance with audit provisions. Say that if there's a flavor tobacco sales restriction, they can have a compliance check to ensure compliance with that provision. And the cost of compliance checks, I know that should be factored into the license fees. The next section, section 13, addresses suspension or revocation of license. And this is one of the benefits of a licensing program as well. It allows a jurisdiction to impose stronger penalties, such as suspension or revocation, which often serve as a stronger deterrent against the violations than merely imposing fines. So here, our model includes, has a graduated scheme whereby the period of suspension increases with the number of violations. And after 4 or more violations, the license, the license is revoked. So Section 14 simply imposes penalties for tobacco retailing without a valid license, and so if a retailer is selling without a valid license, some penalties are imposed before they can before the jurisdiction would grant a license. Section 15 includes additional remedies that a jurisdiction could pursue in the event of violation of the ordinance. Section 16, includes a couple of exceptions. So it is exempts from the provisions, the provision of tobacco products to any person as part of an indigenous practice or a lawfully recognized religious or spiritual ceremony or practice. So essentially it exempts sacred use of tobacco. And it also eliminates, the next provision eliminates penalties for the purchase, use, or possession of a tobacco product by any person not engaged in tobacco retailing. The next section on severabilities is a standard language that that should be included in ordinances, which essentially says that if a court finds that any section of provision is invalid, that invalidity should not affect the other provisions or sections of the ordinance. Section 18 on public records simply makes all of the information that a licensee provides to the city makes it subject to disclosure under the California Public Records Act. And finally, the last section on effective date just states when the ordinance becomes effective. Typically, if a jurisdiction includes a prohibition on flavored tobacco products, they often allow additional time to allow retailers to sell off their products before the ordinance becomes effective. So just to recap, a licensing policy has numerous benefits. It can be used to maintain a list of tobacco retailers within the jurisdiction, so allowing communities to monitor and track tobacco retailers. Through licensing fees, it can help fund the cost of compliance monitoring. Evidence shows that it can help reduce sales to youth and prevent youth tobacco use initiation. It can also be used to reduce the number and density of tobacco retailers and to restrict the types of businesses that can sell tobacco products. And it allows for the imposition of stronger fines, stronger penalties like license suspension or revocation. And it can also be used to address other tobacco control strategies, such as flavored tobacco sales restrictions. Finally, it allows for uniform enforcement of the rules. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Kira, who will talk about the TRL fee calculator. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Julie. So Stephanie and I are both going to walk through the tobacco retail licensing fee calculator that Julie just referenced and Carrie mentioned at the beginning. We wanted to spend a fair amount of time walking through some of the detail here because it's a fairly detailed tool. And I think with a better understanding of how it's supposed to work, it might be a useful exercise for some of you that are trying to sort of figure out how to build and structure TRL programs, and then ultimately how much you're supposed to be charging and what activities are involved in an effective TRL program. So Stephanie has up on the screen here our TRL calculator page. So this lives on our website. You can see the URL at the top there. The paragraph at the beginning outlines, generally what Julie just talked about in terms of why TRL programs are important. And then we have this little drop down there. So there's a little caret, you can click on it, and it explains briefly how the calculator is supposed to work. But what we wanted to do was elaborate more on that and walk you through exactly, you know, what we have here and how it works. So with that, we have two versions of this calculator. So the first one is the one that we're going to walk through, and it just lives on the web page. So it's embedded, but you can type information into it and then get kind of an estimated number at the bottom. And we also have a version that you can download that's an Excel spreadsheet. And while it's locked, so you can't move things around, yeah, right there, you can download it and save it and play around with it yourself. And oh, I also do want to thank Stephanie so much for helping to create this, but also Santa Barbara County was really instrumental in helping come up with some of the inputs here. And then we also consulted with some other jurisdictions and used a variety of sources to figure out exactly what to incorporate into this calculator. So you'll also see we have these two columns here. Thank you, Nydia. Nydia just posted a link to the calculator in the chat. So we have these two columns here. One is detailed option and one is simplified option. And what we mean by that is basically for the jurisdictions that are actually breaking apart all of the staffing time into all these different groups, pieces that I'll go into in a bit. We figured that having different, you know, cells that you can enter numbers into would be really helpful to figure out how much to charge. For other jurisdictions, they may not be breaking it apart into so much detail. It might just be, you know, we have 2 FTEs that are on this task. And so for those jurisdictions, the idea is you can enter, you know, one simple number for your staffing and not have to worry about all these other components. So that's what those two columns are for. They're sort of an either or situation. So we're going to go through the detailed piece though, because there's obviously a lot more information to enter there. We're going to be entering some, well, Stephanie's going to be entering some really specific numbers. These are not like prescriptive. These are suggestions. They are taken with some, you know, they're kind of educated guesses as to what a jurisdiction might be putting towards each of these things, but your jurisdiction might be very different. You might not have entire categories, in which case you don't have to enter a number at all. But we're going to go through and enter so we can show you how this actually works. So the first category that we have here is licensing program applications and renewals. So for that staffing piece, we have a whole bunch of elements that would go into that. And that's going to include things like training your staff to run the program and deal with the applications and the renewals, developing and updating and then reviewing the actual licensing applications themselves, conducting background checks. Once you get information from the applicants, you know, you need to go in and see who these people are. Developing and updating protocols. So you might, over a course of years, want to improve the program and figure out, you know, this communication about the application process didn't work as well as it could have. How can we improve that? So developing and updating protocols. And then having a database that has information about who's applied, who's up for renewal, how many licenses have we issued, how many are active, monitoring expirations. You know, if we have a bunch of expirations coming up, we need to know that. We need to know who has active license, who requires a renewal. Verifying all the information that's provided in an application, reviewing and signing applications, preparing reports and then communicating with city or county staff. So, you know, how many licensed retailers do we have in this jurisdiction? All of that information. Yes, so the number, yes, and Stephanie is putting them in right now, but the numbers that we're entering here are basically annual costs. And a lot of jurisdictions will actually do a study of how much this stuff costs before implementing the program. So it may not be projected, it may just be an educated guess based on how much these things have cost in the past, or it might be, you know, here's what we think this is going to cost based on how much staff time we're estimating it's going to cost. And then you'll see for each of these sections that we have, we also have non-staff time things. So it's equipment and supplies, printing and mailing. If you have to have a meeting, you know, are there administrative costs associated with processing application fees? Do we have to consult with an IT person to develop a database that's useful and effective? And then each of these is going to also have just sort of like an other costs category too, where if your jurisdiction has other things that I would like to consider, you can put those in there. So, yeah, I think I actually don't understand that question. So total annual staff time times staff cost. This is basically, you know, how much, say on an hourly basis, how many hours a specific number of people are putting into this. So I think it may be different for each jurisdiction, but we're just kind of making an estimate. This is certainly not supposed to be, again, kind of telling you in your jurisdiction what to do, but we're just providing an example and a methodology that we think could be useful. So Stephanie's going to walk through the next category.
All right, the next category is talking about mandatory retailer education. So these are the costs associated with meetings, resource development, and any educational trainings, getting staff up to speed. So one thing you want to take into consideration is updating and developing educational materials, and also scheduling and confirming any educational presentations, which, you know, at this point, it could be in person or it could be virtual. So different costs associated with those different types of meetings and trainings. There's also different, you know, developing resources that you might have some non-staff related costs, you know, it's developing fact sheets, information packets, certain things like that, that may take resources. There also may be, sorry for a second here, some printing and mailing costs associated with it. So if you're creating information packets, FAQs, different sheets, you may have to print and mail them. Otherwise, you could do it via email as well, and some e-signatures, depending on what the requirements are. Same thing with meetings. If you're going to have an in-person meeting, you might have food, beverages, any rental costs, room costs. So if you do it virtually, you might not have any costs at all, which we're going to do in this example. And then also you might have costs associated with the tracking, filing, and recording status of the retailer education.
Great. So compliance checks and inspections. This is going to be a really important piece of any TRL program, as Julie explained. You know, without effective compliance checks and ensuring that retailers are actually complying with the requirements that are outlined in your ordinance, the ordinance really can't be as effective as it could be with robust enforcement practices. So here we have a bunch of different categories that we have outlined. One is, of course, conducting site visits. So that's going to be visiting the retailers and seeing what's happening at each of them. Are they complying with the requirements that are outlined in your jurisdiction? Then developing and updating protocols and communications with the retailers. Are they working? Are they not? Over a period of years, how can you improve them? Is that going to cost any staff time? And then recruiting compliance check volunteers. And if you have youth decoys or any kind of purchasing decoys and chaperones, getting those people involved, preparing data collection forms. So how do you mark down when people are complying? When they're not complying. And then if you need to, you know, reserve a specific vehicle, whether it's one that's owned by your jurisdiction or whether you have to rent a vehicle. And then the enforcement agency that you're working with, maybe it's code enforcement, maybe it's public health, training, coordinating with those folks, maybe conducting undercover buy operations. And of course, entering all the data and maintaining the records that you have to see who is complying, who's not, where compliance checks have been done, where they haven't, are they being done more in certain neighborhoods than others, things like that. And then of course, taking all that data and analyzing them takes some time, but doing all of this can be really useful because then you're able to see, is our program helpful? Is it effective? How is it impacting youth sales? Sort of to the person, there was someone asking about data. I think local data can be really, really important and really compelling to local elected officials and other folks. So, taking all of that and analyzing it is really important. Preparing press releases. Did you have a bunch of retailers that weren't complying? Did you have a bunch of retailers that were complying? Do you want to let the public know about that? What about people who participated and who volunteered? Do you have to complete forms to reimburse them? Do you have to get a hold of court documentation for some reason or another? You might need to send certified letters to retailers letting them know about your compliance efforts. And then finally, were there notifications of violation? If so, you have to review and send those. So that just requires a lot of staff time, of course, to run a really effective and robust program. And then we have the other kind of non-staffing pieces that we had before too, along with some other ones. So maybe some transportation. Do we need, is there non-staff time associated with developing resources or documentation? Like, are there some sort of design costs maybe associated with that? And then all these other pieces that we had in the earlier category as well. And then Stephanie's gonna walk through the next category.
All right, thanks, Kira. So the next category is enforcement and penalties. And these are the costs associated with staffing, administrative hearings, and penalty assessment. So things you'll want to take into consideration here are responding to inquiries from retailers resulting from sales in stores or the receipt of letters, notifying tobacco retailers of suspension or revocation details, also monitoring suspensions and or revocations. You want to maintain a database of communication, suspension, revocation schedules, or monetary policies. And again, this could be staff time that you're incorporating in this price. It could be the creation of a spreadsheet or a database. It could be a variety of different methods for maintaining this database. You'll also want to consider reviewing and responding to requests for appeal, and scheduling hearings and notifying parties in writing, which can, take staff time to do. You'll also want to prepare evidence and records for the hearing and appeal hearing and written decision. And then again, we have our non-staffing categories such as file and record keeping, making sure the database is properly developed, maintained, security updates, all of that. You also want to take into consideration some hearing or court fees. So these are the fees associated with administrative hearings or the prosecution in court, if they're applicable. Also, any equipment and supplies used in assessing penalties, such as scales or other supplies. There are also prosecution costs. These are other costs associated with the prosecution in court.
And just as a side note on that one, this doesn't include the cost of actually of an attorney or something like that. It's just sort of the other costs that might be associated with prosecution.
And then again, we have our printing and mailing fees, which you may be considering doing certain things online. Otherwise, mailing it would cost for postage, paper, printing, all of that.
Great. And then our last, second to last category that we have here is alternative penalties. So this is something that we wanted to incorporate while we highly suggest and advise or work with folks to eliminate what are called PUP penalties, purchase, use, or possession. In the jurisdictions where those still exist, we really want to ensure that there are alternative penalty programs that are being developed. And so a TRL program could involve developing that alternative penalty program, and it could involve working with parents and educators, social workers. It might involve training and coordinating with community health workers or social workers, similar to the categories above, having some sort of database to track the program, and then reviewing and you know, maybe eliminating PUP penalty provisions if they exist, or you know, I think it might be possible even to be a little bit more creative with some of these costs, and maybe this is incorporated into alternative penalty programs that are available elsewhere. For example, if there are school resource officers at a school, you know, it is a way of incorporating alternative penalty programs into the TRL fee structure. That again, this is sort of just like a methodology or a suggested methodology, and what works for your jurisdiction might be different. And then at the end here, we do have some miscellaneous costs. So for example, if you need to prepare notices that go out in your local newspaper, if you want to publish compliance check results, if you want to have a public hearing, all of those things might require staff time, and then also publication costs and printing and mailing costs. One thing that we did not include here, well, actually, why don't we go through just how it works at the bottom, and then I'll talk about maybe some of the things that might not be included, and kind of next steps. So as you'll see, there's a formula here. Each of those categories that we just walked through has its own separate total. And then we have a total direct costs category at the bottom there. So it adds everything up that we just entered. If you have any other costs, you can put them in that little box above there. And then if you have an indirect cost rate that you want to use, we have a box for that as well. So we're going to use a 20% indirect cost rate. And then there's a grand total box right there. And then the way that this would work is essentially you figure out how many licenses you have, how many retailers you have in your jurisdiction. We're going to use the example of 100. And then it, you know, results in a suggested annual cost per license. So for this example, it would be $464. This is obviously like a somewhat larger jurisdiction, but the same methodology should work for smaller jurisdictions. You're just going to have probably a lot less staff time and maybe a lot less involvement in the compliance check piece and developing resources and educational materials and stuff like that. So that's how this works. Again, we have a downloadable version, and we have a bunch of questions. I guess before we dive into the questions, Carrie, I might let you sift through them a little bit, but before we dive into the questions, I do just want to mention a few categories that I think would be really interesting to consider in a TRL fee program, but that we just haven't really figured out how to do yet. So one that I've heard a lot about is incorporating the costs that are being imposed on public entities for properly disposing of e-cigarettes, which, as you may or may not know, can be pretty costly, and it falls on right now schools, courts, other public agencies that are collecting e-cigarettes, which are hazardous waste under federal and California law, need to be disposed of properly and handled properly. So whether or not that's something that could be incorporated into the TRL, I think that would require probably some study at the level of an individual jurisdiction to maybe get a sense of what the waste problem is in their jurisdiction. Similarly, tobacco product waste that is comprised of cigarette butts, which is the most littered item on a per item basis in the world, and does impose millions of dollars on jurisdictions to clean up, especially when they enter waterways and things like that. So I think that there are a lot of people thinking about maybe how do we incorporate this into a regulatory program? And then also other kind of ways of incorporating alternative penalty structures or even prevention prevention programs. I think that there's some creative ways of thinking about this, but it requires, you know, I think more people to come together and figure out how the best way to go about doing this might be. So with that, I think we should probably switch to questions.
Okay, this is great. We do have quite a few questions, and I'll start asking them right now. The first one is, I'll start from the bottom here. Thanks so much for this. The viewers asks, do you have a sense on how transferable this tool may be for other retailer license types, such as cannabis retailers? Of course, some tailoring would be required regardless, but just curious if there has been any thought regarding this.
I have not personally thought about that. I think it's a good idea. I mean, some of these costs are going to be, you know, present in any licensing program, even, you know, like alcoholic beverage licensing. I mean, staff time to kind of run these types of programs and track compliance checks and collect data, all of that will likely exist for a lot of other licensing type schemes, even, you know, maybe pharmacies, like things like that. So I think that there are elements that could be transferable to other contexts, but of course there are also pieces of this that are going to be specific to tobacco retailers.
Okay. All right, thank you. We just got, how do you account for staffing rate increases year to year?
Well, I think that a lot of jurisdictions are going to be revising their fees to account for not only things like inflation, but also things like that. So and every jurisdiction again is probably going to do these things a little bit different as to how often they revise their fees. It's not like they set one fee and that's the fee forever. So I think that there's room for.
Just to add to what Kira said, you know, the model that I went through includes the language. Fee shall be established from time to time by resolution of the city council. So it already provides for periodic review and modification as necessary.
Okay, thank you. Julie, there's a question here about data that links. Is there any data that links any one of these measures, enforcement actions, severity of penalties, difficulty of obtaining retail license to selling tobacco products with prevalence of underage selling of tobacco products? Just wondering if there was any data that you were aware of.
I'm not sure if there is any data that specifically links those independent, you know, components to youth sales, but we know that generally, a well-enforced TRL, well-enforced licensing programs does lead to reduced youth sales of tobacco to youth. So we know that, you know, strong tobacco retailer licensing has that impact in reducing unlawful sales to youth. But whether or not there is data, I've not encountered data that sort of, you know, looks at those specific components in terms of their effect. But generally, a strong retail licensing program that is well enforced does lead to reduced sales to underage persons.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's another question. What do you suggest for jurisdictions that may be willing to pass a TRL, but don't want to take the time to find these costs themselves and would prefer that we propose a fee and the justification for that fee ourselves?
Well, I mean, that's kind of what the calculator is for. I think it's supposed to be helping jurisdictions who don't want to figure all this out and have to figure out what goes into a TRL. I mean, every jurisdiction is still going to have to do some research, but that I think hopefully this calculator will be helpful to those jurisdictions that are being asked to kind of like shoulder maybe some of the job of figuring out what goes into a fee.
And then we have, if a local jurisdiction wanted to revise the fees, would elected officials have to vote on it, or how could we legally change it?
Often it will be on the elected officials to set a fee, but I think it depends. I mean, I guess I've seen various versions, but Julie, I don't know if you have other insight on that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like I already mentioned, the ordinance, the resolution is typically set by resolution of whoever the governing body is, whether it's for a city, whether the city council or the board of supervisors for a county. So, so if there is any need for revision and reviewing the policy, there isn't need for, I don't think there's any need for any kind of vote or community involvement, but the city council does have the responsibility to set the fees and to modify the fees by resolution.
Okay, let's see. Fees can be timed. All right, let's see. I think we'll ask a few more questions and then we may just wrap it up. I just want to reiterate that this recording will be available on our website. How do you handle the cost of enforcement officers to do the work, given that it's likely not covered in the CTCP budget?
I'm not quite sure I understand that question. This is a key barrier in whether there can be coordination between CTCP and enforcement. Yeah, I mean, I think that might be I don't know. Every jurisdiction might have a different kind of agency conducting enforcement. But I think that might just, yeah, Andrew, also who runs our program, is commenting that the CTCP budget doesn't have anything to do with how jurisdictions fund their TRLs. I think, yeah, we're talking mostly at a, like, you know, a city and county level here. I don't know that CTCP's budget really should impact anything. If you're asking, you know, one agency might be playing some role in the TRL enforcement program that isn't public health, I mean, I think that is still accounted. It can be accounted for in the TRL calculator. It isn't like all of the costs have to be related to one agency. I think it's just, you can enter the numbers that are relevant and then figure out where that has to come from, as is appropriate in your jurisdiction.
Okay. Well, I think that this is a good time to wrap it up. We will follow up with those of you who have sent us questions and we haven't responded to them. And I'd like to thank our presenters, Kira, Julie, and Stephanie. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you tune in for our next webinar. So thank you. Bye-bye.